Evening, everyone. Welcome to The Next Revolution. I'm Steve Hilton, and this is the home of positive populism. We have a packed show for you tonight and a great panel. Katrina Pearson from the Trump 2020 campaign is with us, along with executive editor of the National Review, Rehan Salam. Later, in a Swamp Watch special, we expose the multi-billion-dollar mess of government contracts. The CEO of an amazing startup who says his company was frozen out by the bureaucrats joins us live. Plus, new evidence of the deep state's effort to undermine the Trump presidency. We talk to an insider with explosive details. Also tonight, good news on jobs this week, undermined by Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, who proves he has no clue what's going on with American workers. You won't believe what he had to say. And if you think the elite's heads are exploding over the prospect of Donald Trump winning the Nobel Peace Prize, wait till you see the big idea that really would drive the president's critics crazy. That's all coming up. But first, I want to join some dots for you tonight. The Mueller investigation, the media, Stormy Daniels, last weekend's White House Correspondents' Dinner, and Brexit. It's all connected, and here's how. Let's start with the real world. Good news on jobs, good news on household incomes, good news diplomatically with North Korea. A lot of good news. But the Sunday shows today on CNN and NBC, they were absolutely comically obsessed with who said what when over Stormy Daniels, the Mueller probe, and all the rest of it. The elitist media don't care about real issues and real policy because it doesn't affect them. They don't care about jobs and incomes because they're rich and comfortable. They don't care about education because their kids go to private schools or they live in such fancy neighborhoods that the public schools are practically private schools anyway. They don't care about the real world. They've never created a job or done anything useful. Their whole world is just words. The way they cover this president, they're not political reporters anymore. They're just TV critics. What did Trump say? What did you think about Rudy Giuliani's latest performance? Now, here's where it comes together with the White House Correspondents' Dinner last weekend. Peggy Noonan in the Wall Street Journal wrote something so powerful about Jake Tapper and Morning Joe and all the Trump-hating crew. Here she is. The dinner is elite journalists telling half of America, we hate you. It's as if they break out of their this just in face and say, you know how you think we don't share your values and respect your views? You know how you think that we're biased, self-infatuated twerps who think we're better than you? It's true. We do. Ha ha. As we saw today on the Sunday shows, the elitist media usually try to cover up their hatred of Trump and his supporters in high-minded pontificating about democratic norms and the rule of law. But that facade was blown apart this week. First by Judge Ellis on Friday when he showed that the real threat to democracy and the rule of law is the Mueller investigation itself. As the judge put it, you don't really care about Mr. Manafort. You really care about what information Mr. Manafort can give you to lead you to Mr. Trump and an impeachment. The American people feel pretty strongly about no one having unfettered power. Exactly. The ruling elite want unfettered power to get rid of the man they hate. They want to overturn the 2016 election. And now let's bring Stormy Daniels into the picture. Whatever happened in the past, the agenda now is very clear. Just listen to her lawyer.
I do not think that the president will last through the balance of his term. I just don't. Now, we're going to find out if I'm right or wrong, but I think he's going to ultimately resign the presidency. Mr. Trump will not serve out his term. No way, no how. He will be forced to ultimately resign. I believe that ultimately he will be forced to resign due to information that is going to come to light in connection with our case, as well as the raids by the FBI.
That's what it's about. Finally, let's connect Stormy Daniels and Brexit. Now that's something I bet you never thought you'd hear in one sentence. Over in the UK right now, the ruling elite is plotting to overturn the populist revolution that led to the Brexit vote. The debate is whether to kind of stay in the EU really, or to have a second referendum. You know, because the people got it wrong the first time. Brexit, Stormy Daniels, the Mueller investigation, the White House Correspondents' Dinner, the elitist media. It is all one extremely ugly picture. The ruling elite saying to you, the people, how dare you try and take power away from us? We're not going to stand for that. We are witnessing a counter-revolution by elitists everywhere. And for the sake of democracy and the rule of law, it must be confronted and defeated. I'd love to know what you think of that. Please follow us at Steve Hilton X and at NextRev FNC. And now let's find out what our panel think. Executive editor of the National Review, Rehan Salam. You saw him on the very first edition of this show. We don't have enough bald people on this show, so very good news that you're here. Senior advisor with the Trump 2020 campaign, Katrina Pearson. Katrina, I want to start with you because you've lived through this,
yes,
through the 2016 campaign. It's happening all over again. They just can't stand the fact that this outsider ran for office, and then the people had the nerve to actually give him power. And they just want to overturn that, don't they? That's what this is about.
Well, look, Steve, you can't imagine they want to just give up all of this unfettered power. But I do think a lot of people are shocked to see just how in your face that a lot of these agencies are pushing to try to essentially overthrow the President of the United States. And it was very important throughout the 2016 campaign that the President was 100% on board with the people. Mm-hmm. He campaigned on that. He talked about draining the swamp. And now that he's in office and trying to do just that, of course they're going to fight back. It's no secret that these agencies have been out of control. It's no secret. What did people think that President Obama meant when he said he wanted to fundamentally transform America? Mm-hmm. We're looking at Obama holdovers causing problems. Mm-hmm. They have weaponized processes for anyone, not just political appointees, but people that even like the president inside the agencies.
We're going to hear about that later. That's exactly right. That's what's going on.
It is, and it's truly unfortunate. But also, I think it's kind of enlightening to the American public, mm-hmm, because a lot of the time you would see people like myself who've been doing this for nearly a decade talking about reining in the federal government and putting, mm-hmm, it back in its constitutional box. The average person at home, they don't understand just how far we came in the 2016 election to losing our republic, mm-hmm, and now it's on full display.
So, Rehan, look, you're in the thick of the Never Trump crowd in many ways. A lot of the people you work with alongside, you know that world very well. What do you think those Never Trump Republicans and the elite journalists I talked about, what would they say to the argument I just made that actually they keep talking about undermining democracy and the rule of law, but their effort to undermine this president means that they're the ones who are guilty of that?
I can't really speak for anyone but myself, and what I will say is this. The president oftentimes can be his own worst enemy. If you are going to try to effect radical and dramatic change, you need to do it carefully, systematically, and you need to deprive your opponents, mm-hmm, of sympathetic plaintiffs. Mm-hmm. If you're looking at the Trump presidency since January 2017, there have been a lot of changes, including a lot of personnel changes that the president himself has endorsed. Why is that? Go back to January 2017. You see ideas that were consistent with the Trump agenda, yet which were not handled terribly well, mm-hmm, which were not handled very carefully. And when you do that, you create oxygen from your enemies. What I see right now, mm-hmm, is that many of the president's critics in the media, what they try to do is become best-selling authors. They try to become celebrities. They try to gin up enormous donations for their Democratic campaigns or what have you by baiting the president. Right. The number one most effective thing you can do if you were a critic of the president is bait him into a confrontation, into a fight with you. That makes you a hero to those in the country who do not want him in the White House. And the president takes the bait a lot too often. If he had not fired James Comey as precipitously as he did, he may well have had good, strong grounds for doing so, mm-hmm, but if he did it with greater care and discipline, there would not have been a Mueller investigation. So what I'm saying is, if you truly want radical, dramatic, serious, systematic change, mm-hmm, you have to do it with a plan and a careful approach. You cannot give your enemies weapons and ammunition to use against you.
I get the intent there, but Katrina, I mean, my pushback would be, yeah, but there's no even chance to get that going because all the enemies inside the system are trying to stop that from happening.
Well, absolutely, and I understand where you're coming from also, but let me just say that if, let's just say President Trump went into office and he did things in this nice, calm, and fashionable way, would we even know what the deep state was up to?
Yes.
Would we even know what's been going on in this country for a very long time? And we probably wouldn't. And maybe this silent coup would have been successful had he not been what you would call taking the bait, I would call fighting back. I mean, it's one of the biggest criticisms that W had. he wouldn't fight back. He wouldn't defend himself. And honestly, it's a criticism of a lot of Republicans. They're afraid of their own shadows half the time. So this is refreshing to people who look at Donald Trump and go, you know what? He's not going to take it, because they don't want to take it. That's why they voted for him. And because of all of these things that you've mentioned, we now see, because it has exposed through that process what's happening in the country.
It's very transparent now.
Yes.
The fact that they're trying to stop him. I think that's the big issue here.
You've been in the heat of the fight. I respect that. But what I will say is that George W. Bush was also pretty reckless in his decision-making sometimes. I am not saying be fashionable. I am not saying go with the crowd. I'm not saying go with the Georgetown cocktail party set. What I'm saying is be methodical.
No, I get it.
Be more methodical and careful and deliberate than your enemies.
But you're assuming that President Trump isn't methodical. You're assuming that there is no plan. The president, this is not something that Donald Trump just woke up one day and said, I want to be president. This has been a process. Some of these things he's been talking about since the 80s. These are things that he's been studying. And one of the best kept secrets is Donald Trump was going to Tea Party rallies 5 years before he entered the race. He's very much aware of what's going on. He's very much, he understands the way politicians have behaved in the past, but that's not what he wants to do. He wanted to be the bull in the china shop. He wanted to come in and shake things up to make those changes, because I believe you cannot make changes by being that quiet, methodical individual.
It's not about being quiet, by the way. It's not about being quiet.
I'm going to speak for myself. I couldn't agree more. Having been inside a government trying to do that kind of thing and just seeing the forces arrayed against you and trying to do it in a reasonable way simply doesn't work. And the final point is that the enemies of this agenda and this populist revolution, they were trying to do this before he even got inaugurated. They were gearing up to stop him because it was a mortal threat to their whole existence to have someone like this come in. That's it. Sorry. Going to have to move on. Coming up, Swamp Watch takes on out-of-control government contracts. And after the break, new evidence, as we've just been discussing, of the deep state's plot against President Trump. The full story on that is next. Welcome back, everyone. According to a recent article by a federal security clearance attorney, political opponents of President Trump inside the federal bureaucracy have weaponized the security clearance process in order to stall the president's nominations and slow down White House operations. That attorney, Sean Bigley, joins us now. Sean, thank you so much for joining us here. I read this piece that you wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal this week, and I have to say it was one of those things where I wasn't shocked, but at the same time felt that this can't be real. It was so helpful for you to describe in detail what's going on. Tell us the specific case that you've been working on, and then we'll get to the broader lessons from it.
Absolutely. So the case is involving a gentleman named Adam Lovinger. He's a senior Defense Department official who was on loan to the White House. He was actually brought over there as a by-name request early in the administration.
What does that mean, by-name request?
They knew of his reputation, and essentially they decided that they wanted him as part of the White House policy team.
So the White House specifically said, we want this guy on our team.
They did. They reached into the bureaucracy and plucked him right out.
Right.
And unfortunately, his political views were not appreciated by those in the Pentagon in power, combined with the fact that he had actually exposed some corruption and some cronyism in contracting in a particular office in the Pentagon called the Office of Net Assessment. It's essentially the Pentagon's internal think tank. And what they're supposed to be doing is their namesake, net assessments, which are basically long-term strategy of emerging threats against the United States, things like Iran, China, cyber. And those were precisely the things that Mr. Lovinger thought they should be focusing on. Instead, what the office has become over the past few years is a slush fund for politically connected contractors to do absolutely ridiculous research reports at major expense to the taxpayer. So,
like what?
For example, there was a research report that came out on whether or not Americans are a warlike people. And that's something that the taxpayers were on the hook for, some large sum of money to produce. There was another one, whether or not there was enough national security, coastal elites in the national security bureaucracy. $50 million that this office has shelled out to produce these reports.
So this guy exposed that, and then the White House wanted him, and he was blocked. When you say his political views were unacceptable, what does that mean? What political views?
Well, precisely. His political views were essentially in line with the president's and the administration's on issues like Iran, on China, on things like that I think most people would view as important things for the national security bureaucracy to focus on, and unfortunately those were not in favor.
Okay, so this is really disturbing because you've got the bureaucracy saying that the White House can't have someone working there that agrees with the president and has done the public a service by exposing corruption and waste of money. Who is making that decision? Where's the sort of location of the problem? For we want to be really specific, not just the federal bureaucracy. Is it Secretary Mattis? Who do we blame for this?
So I think it's really important that we drill down and identify precisely who these actors are, because part of the problem to date has been a lot of these folks have been able to hide in the shadows, if you will, hide behind the titles of their offices or just the bureaucracy in general. And in this case, it's a very obscure arm of the Pentagon known as the Washington Headquarters Service. It's an administrative arm, and in essence, it's where a lot of the personnel operations happen, the security clearance operations. And unfortunately, what you have there is some entrenched bureaucrats who have essentially decided to weaponize the process to keep Mr. Levenger and others like him out of the administration.
So it sounds like Secretary Mattis needs to really take action and deal with this. Katrina, this is exactly the kind of thing you were talking about.
Well, not only that, but back in September, there was a government report talking about the number of individuals from the Obama administration that left their appointments and went into civil service. And that's been happening, you can make the argument it's happened before, but I think it's fair to say that we're in a political climate where it's not just about doing a specific job. People are now pushing political agendas or thwarting, in the case of President Trump, and that's a big part of the problem. Maybe it's time to reform civil service, hiring and firing tactics. But more importantly, this is not just happening in one agency. It's happening in almost all of the agencies where, like I said, you don't have to be a political appointee. If they just know you support Trump, you have the careers in that agency that are just causing all kinds of trouble for you.
I mean, this is really serious. This is going back to the previous discussion, this is an example of the counter-revolution.
Well, I think it's also true that here in America we have an adversarial legal system, and it is very important that we have folks like Sean who do a great job of fighting their corner, fighting for their clients. It's also the case, however, that there's another side to the story. And here on this panel, we don't necessarily have folks who have that expertise to say, hey, wait a second, we are patriotic folks who are in the civil service who take our jobs very seriously, and we want this to be a deliberative, serious process where we're carefully vetting folks. I'm sure that Mr. Levenger is a very admirable and great person, but we don't know the entire story about what's going on, right?
And by the way, it's very hard to get it, isn't it? Because they're so untransparent about the whole thing.
That's right. And to Katrina's point, I mean, there's an old saying that personnel is policy. And essentially what you have here is the low-hanging fruit. In other words, the bureaucracy has decided security clearances are an easy grab for us. They're something that we can control. There's no oversight. They're not appealable to the courts. And so this is a really easy way for the bureaucracy to essentially thwart the president's policies and his agenda by keeping out people who will execute it.
So just to Katrina's point was like reform, civil service reform. What is the kind of reform that might deal with this problem?
I think what needs to happen specifically with security clearances is there needs to be some amendments put in place to current law that specifically define what happens to you if you weaponize this process, if you retaliate against someone, if you use it for a purpose other than what it's intended. Right now, we don't have that under current law, and so in essence, you have certain folks in the bureaucracy who have really decided that this is something that they can run with. And
doesn't that cripple the system with more litigation? Because fundamentally, we're talking about national security here. You're talking about people who might have legitimate objections and concerns. You have serious secrets. You want to protect the national security of this country. Now, if you add a whole new layer of litigation, that's going to be great for the lawyers, but I'm not sure it's going to be great for the country when you actually want to make quick decisions, you want to make reliable decisions.
But I think in one word to sum this up is accountability.
Right.
It's that simple. And this has been discussed. The report back in the Washington Times, and I quote, Obama's political appointees switched to career jobs without obtaining necessary approval from the Office of Personnel Management. Where's the accountability?
There's even a term for it. I think they call it burrowing in. They sort of dig themselves in. I think this is a huge issue, this civil service reform issue. Sorry, we've got to leave it there. There's never enough time. It's such a big issue. Sean, thank you. I really appreciate you bringing this to our attention, and I hope we can keep on it because it's so important to getting this agenda delivered. Coming up, the elites have lost the people's trust. Obviously, one of the world's leading economists is here to tell us why and how we can fix it. That's next.
He's on the right.
You know.
I know.
You know better than anyone.
She's on the left.
But the polling doesn't back you up.
Together, they're simply Benson and Harv.
We disagree on almost everything, but we really do like each other.
Refreshing, smart talk, and powerful debate.
I think young people are sick and tired of politics being nasty.
Benson and Harv premieres Monday, May 7th on...
Welcome back, everyone. You may have come across my next guest when she wrote a powerful book called Dead Aid, which argued that overseas aid actually makes poverty worse in developing countries, not better. Now she's out with a new book arguing that the ruling elites everywhere have lost the people's trust, and she's got a plan to fix it. Here she is, one of the world's top economists, Dr. Dambisa Moyo, author of Edge of Chaos, Why Democracy is Failing to Deliver Economic Growth and How to Fix It. Dambisa, thank you so much for joining us. I really am excited to talk to you.
Thank you.
I think your book is one of those things where most people will look at it and say, well, some of these ideas are brilliant and some are completely crazy. And to me, that is the sign of a really interesting, provocative argument. So first of all, just tell us what the argument is, and then perhaps we can look at some of your specific ideas.
Sure. So the book is essentially in two parts. The first part lays out what I see are 6 key massive economic headwinds that are threatening to upend the global economy. These are all long-term, deeply entrenched intergenerational challenges, things like demographic shifts, income inequality issues, worries about the amount of debt we're carrying, and of course technology and the jobless underclass and the risks that come from there. But it's also about the fact that we have short-termism deeply embedded in liberal democracies. We have elections ever so often, and this creates a schism or a mismatch between long-term economic problems and short-term challenges. And essentially what the book is trying to do is to propose a reform that targets the 2 key aspects of the weaknesses in democracy today. One is around legitimacy, which you touched on in the introductory remarks that you had this evening, but also the second bit around myopia, and try to get policymakers focused on these deeply important issues.
So what's interesting about that, I think, and I haven't really heard this from put together so well as you have, is you've got these economic problems that we talk about a lot, and you're saying that the answer is not necessarily economic policy, that may be part of it, but it's actually reforms to democracy.
Absolutely.
The way democracy works is the real priority for solving the economic problems. Just give us some of the specific ideas for improving democracy that you would put near the top of your list?
So, Steve, it's a great question because I was really critically focused on making sure we have a menu of options. And what's critically important to mention here is that all 10 of the proposals that I offer in the book to reform democracy do exist in precedent around the world today. So as much as some people might roll their eyes and say this is impossible, they actually exist. Things like extending political terms or actually trying to encourage more voter engagement and ensuring that we have minimum standards for politicians. But also it's about increasing, not decreasing, increasing the pay to politicians, but also ensuring that they justify that compensation by us being able to focus on outputs and outcomes in the economy.
So that one was interesting. You talk about literally performance-related pay.
Yes.
For politicians and those in government.
Absolutely.
How can that work?
Well, it works. It already works in Singapore. As you may be aware, the head of state in Singapore earns about $1.4 million a year. But what I think is more interesting is that the cabinet officials, so the Secretary of State and Foreign Affairs and Treasury, etc., they each earn 30 to 40% bonuses depending on how the economy performs. Things like what the GDP outcome looks like. If inflation is low, but also living standard improvements, life expectancy, etc. etc. But there's also embedded in that this idea of a clawback. So if there is a lack of performance that's revealed later on, you're able to claw back from the pensions of these politicians. And frankly, I mean, it may seem kind of crazy, but the truth of the matter is that we've already seen significant innovation and reforms in private compensation. So I don't see why we shouldn't see that sort of thing also in public space.
All right, Rayhan, how about that? Performance-related pay for politicians. You think people, I think, want them to be paid less, not more. But if they deliver the results, what's wrong with it?
I think that Dambisa is doing a brilliant job of provoking people, of getting them to think hard about how do we need to structurally change our democracy. If 2016 taught us anything, it is that there is a deep well of discontent. And unless we start thinking more creatively and just stop shooting down every single new kind of provocative, zany-seeming idea, we're not going to make any progress. So I applaud her for that. As to how performance pay would work in practice, I would be very open to experimenting with it, certainly.
Okay. So, Katrina, one of the other ideas that caught my eye in Dambisa's book was doing something to deal with the problem of the career politicians who never do anything else, never do anything in the real world, never understand how to create jobs or whatever, and seem to sort of get into all the different offices and get elected, and just all they ever do is politics. She's talking about requiring real-world experience, as we see, of course, with President Trump. But, I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's great, and I agree. It's definitely thought-provoking. I don't agree so much with the idea of a civics test and meeting a certain standard. I mean, we have Harvard and Yale graduates crawling all over Washington, D.C., and they've pretty much run the place into the ground. But it's definitely something to think about and consider. And with regard to the electorate, I noticed that one of the things she focused on was having an uninformed electorate.
Yeah.
And I think that's really the biggest problem, because when we have career politicians, because our electorate isn't very informed on what they're doing.
Right.
But I think that's more of a dysfunction in having just a two-party system that has essentially made laws protecting the incumbency than it is on democracy in and of its whole. I mean, the people are truly in control of our country. It's just that we have made it as such people aren't aware of what's going on. I think the parties like it that way.
Well, just if I may, I think Katrina makes a really important point about the extent to which a two-party duopoly engages in incumbent protection. Almost whenever you see a campaign finance reform, it is generally something that is designed to make things better for incumbents and tougher for challengers. This is basically a kind of cartel. And I think that if you're really thinking about stabilizing democracy, broadening democracy, you've got to think about all of these folks who feel unrepresented in the system as it exists. There are a lot of folks in the heartland who feel that way, but also there are folks in the cities,
because it's such a, but I want to make sure we get a last word from Dambisa. Any kind of quick responses on what the panel have said, or anything you want to get across?
Just the critical point I would stress here is that the weighted voting system that that was mentioned a moment ago is not about education, and this is a salient point. Do not conflate knowledge and understanding and engagement, which we want from voters, with education. It's not about having a degree. It's not about having gone to Harvard or Yale. It's about ensuring that our voters actually know what they're engaged, what the civics aspects of society are, how the system works, and what the key aspects of the main issues on the ballot are.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. More in the book, Edge of Chaos. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
That was a great discussion. Really appreciate it. Coming up, a special Swamp Watch tonight takes on government contracts. Why does all the money go to the insiders while startups are frozen out? We'll ask the CEO of one of those startups next. Government contractors wield enormous power at both the federal and state level. Many of the contracts are controlled by large corporations who guard their monopolies by donating to politicians' re-election campaigns and by taking down any startups that would dare to innovate in their market. Government contracts are tonight's Swamp Watch. A Brooklyn-based startup called Propel developed an app that aims to help food stamp recipients manage their budgets, make healthy purchases, and find job opportunities. But the app relies on data compiled by a big government contractor called Conduent, an offshoot of Xerox. Conduent's been trying to squeeze Propel out by limiting access to its data in a number of states. Here with me to discuss is Propel's CEO, Jimmy Chen, and Lincoln Network President, Aaron Chin. So, I just would love you, Jimmy, just to tell us the story of what's been going on and the threat to the business that you've started.
Sure. Steve, thank you so much for having me on the show today. I started Propel 4 years ago to take the best practices of Silicon Valley software and apply them towards really fighting poverty by making the food stamp program more effective. You know, we've got users in over all 50 states. We have more than 1 million people who use the app each month, and it's one of the top-rated finance apps in the App Store. One of the things that's been going on over the past couple months is that these state contractors that involve the EBT program have been adding new technical changes to the way that they serve data to make it more difficult for people to access their balance through apps like Fresh EBT.
And so what has been the actual result for real people who are trying to manage things on a tight budget? How's it affected them?
Well, the technical changes made by the particular contractor were intended to block bots from accessing their information. And since our users are not bots, there's a real human on the other end of the phone just trying to check their balance so they can go grocery shopping. We're able to renew service for most of our users. But the challenge has been that the conversation has sort of shifted to who gets to really control the innovation for low-income populations. And we really think that this is a great opportunity for us to continue to innovate in the public interest.
So I just want to turn to you, Aaron. You hear this over and over again, where you've got these big contracts rewarded, and you've got startups that try and come up with a cheaper, better way of doing the same thing or creating a new way of solving a problem, and they just squeezed out because the insiders won't let them actually challenge them. It's a wider problem. This is one instance of it, but it's a real problem, isn't it, with government contracting?
Yeah, you're exactly right, and this is something that the Trump administration has made a priority for them by creating an official office, the Office of Innovation, by passing the Government Modernization Act, and also creating the Center for Excellence model. The incumbents are a cabal group of large technology players that are opposed to Silicon Valley methods, are opposed to open source technology in an effort to continue to build walled gardens to basically make citizen data their own data. As a means of monetizing.
You're probably
and
losing
creating
a few people there with. I just want to stop you there. You're probably losing a few people there with the walled gardens thing. Let's just break that down in plain English. What are the insiders doing to kind of protect their position and stop their challenges? What's going on here?
So one of the means is they encourage the government to pass more and more regulations to prevent upcomers from actually being able to implement technology. Another way that they do it is they make procurement process itself a very complicated and insider way of actually gaining these contracts. For example, you know that no one actually knows who approves these contracts usually. Like, it could be some rando person who has a low-level title in some agency. The way people think about it in Silicon Valley is like, well, the CTO should approve a very large contract. Not so in the government. Yeah, exactly. And you often don't know who in the agency as actually approving the spending, and let alone you don't at the end of the day know the full requirements because it's often an insider game about who knows who actually can move the ball down the court. And people in Silicon Valley, we're much more product minded. We're much more what's the best product should win the day. In DC, it's much more about who you know and like who's in your own personal network and what work have you done in the past, which buys itself against upstarts like the CEO you have on right now.
Well, you basically just described the swamp right there. I mean, perfect description of how it works. And remember, this is not just this is trillions of dollars of our viewers' money going in these contracts. Jimmy, just a quick last word to you. I mean, what do you make of how this has been handled? You've got some attention for this. Have you got any response, and do you see the situation improving?
Yeah, I think we're really optimistic that we're going to kind of win the day here, and that fundamentally we're building a product that makes lives better for low-income Americans throughout the country, and that we're really trying to build support behind our cause, throughout the country for people who can kind of take actions to help us prevent the innovation from being stifled here.
Jimmy, thank you so much, Aaron, and to you too. I think I'm going to keep on this because it's one of those things that sounds really complicated and fiddly, but actually it's so important. This is a key part of the President's Drain the Swamp agenda to reform all this. It's good to hear from you, Aaron, that this is part of what's being worked on in the White House and elsewhere. So we'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you both for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Coming up, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin completely out of touch when it comes to jobs in America. You won't believe what he had to say. That's next. Don't go away. Bringing back jobs was one of President Trump's biggest pledges, and he is certainly delivering. On Friday, the new jobs report showed that unemployment fell to 3.9%, an 18-year low. In fact, it's looking so good that employers are actually having trouble finding skilled workers. The AP recently reported that because of the skills gap, many jobs are going unfilled because there's just no one trained to do them. But Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin doesn't seem to think it's a problem. Look what he said this week to our own Maria Bartiromo.
I think some of it is training, but I'm not hearing that from the companies I speak to.
You're not? Okay, because a number of managers have told me we need more workers. You don't hear that?
I don't, not at this point.
So, Katrina, I think the President really understands this. It doesn't get reported, of course, because everyone's obsessed with Stormy Daniels, but I've heard him talk about the need for job training and apprenticeships, and he seems to get... I don't think Steve Mnuchin got the memo.
Well, let me defend the Secretary just for a minute. Okay. There is a 10,000-foot view. You know, Mnuchin was a part of the campaign, a broader picture. He's just saying that they haven't told him that. But again, the bigger picture, and I think we have two problems here, because this is much bigger. First, you have a public education system that has done a disservice to many children in this country. And second, we have an immigration problem that has contributed to why we don't have enough skilled workers in the country. And when you look at the things that the President's trying to do, you know, you had Ivanka out promoting STEM. There's a ton of these programs available, but children just aren't participating in those programs. And we have to ask ourselves, well, would you, if you knew that companies prior to cyber were importing workers and displacing American workers in the technology industry, would you go into a STEM program? The answer is probably no. So we need to do a better job at getting policy back on track that incentivizes people, young people, to go into these STEM programs so that we can get people trained. So science and maths and so on. I think Katrina's exactly right with bringing the immigration story into it, because I feel that what's going on here is that he doesn't get that, you know, they've done a great job, as we talk about with deregulation and the tax bill and so on, at stimulating economic growth. That's great. Things are going really well. People are hiring. That's fantastic. Now they're saying we don't have enough skilled workers. So you know what the next thing's going to be? Oh, we need more importing of workers from overseas. That exacerbates the immigration problem, which is one of the other things they're trying to solve. So he's got to figure this out.
Steve, you're getting it. So basically, all of the attacks on Mnuchin for saying that, hey, labor shortages aren't a big deal, they're all coming from people who are saying, yes, we need to import low-wage guest workers.
Right.
But the real answer is people have kept saying that as the economy grows, we're going to have inflation, all this is going to happen. No, what's happened is people have been coming off the sidelines. What's been happening is unemployment keeps falling lower and lower. We have more room to grow. And I think that the President recognizes that, and that has to be the heart of the rest of his presidency, seeing to it that actually we let the economy run hot, so that actually a lot of people, you know, look at Maine. Maine was constantly importing seasonal guest workers from overseas. Then you put a clampdown on that. Then what happens? Then suddenly, the governor of Maine, you're furloughing convicts, your furloughed offenders, people who need an opportunity, who otherwise would be looked over, and now they're getting an opportunity to earn and to become part of the community again. There are millions of Americans out there who are still on the sidelines. So when a company, when a corporate CEO tells you, we have a labor shortage, why don't you put in the time and resources to actually train workers? Because there are a ton of willing folks there if you are willing to pay the right wage and put in the time. So I think that he's actually right. You've got to put the pressure on the companies. Don't let them come and whine to you about what government has to do for them. Let them innovate their way out of the problem. That's what capitalism is supposed to be about.
That's the sort of populist argument at its heart, isn't it? Don't listen.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, to his point, 900,000 middle-aged workers have re-entered the labor force. And the President has inspired this. People now have hope. They want to get out there. They want to take these jobs. And it's going to be incumbent upon these companies to put in the time and the resources. You mentioned the tax cuts.
Yes.
Many of these companies have said, you know what, we're going to reinvest in our employees. That is a great thing. But we have to do more. And that is getting to reforming immigration, and that is getting to public education, because we've got to get young people involved in a lot of these STEM programs.
But I think that's one of the things that I was certainly in the 2016 campaign. You remember, the President talked about all these things. I know what, you know, obviously the famous build the wall and so, but he talked about school reform, and he talked about skills and training, and since the election he's talked about apprenticeships, and I think it's great discussion. I think that the lesson is exactly as you said. These companies have to do more to actually respond to the economic growth by training people to take the jobs that are available. Thank you so much. Great to see you both. Coming up, if you think the elite's heads are exploding over President Trump potentially winning the Nobel Peace Prize, what on earth would they say if he actually did what we're about to suggest? Don't go away.